They arrived in Manila under a gathering cloud, not a single crisis, but a convergence of them. Leaders from across Southeast Asia came together at a moment when global turbulence has begun to rewrite the rules of regional diplomacy. What would once have been almost routine summit choreography has become a test of whether the Association of Southeast Asian Nations can move with the speed, unity, and political imagination the moment demands. The Philippines, under President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr., is serving as ASEAN chair for 2026. The responsibility is heavy and immediate. Delegations stepped off planes with agendas that went far beyond trade and tourism. They carried concerns about energy, shipping, and food security. They carried the human costs of internal conflict, and they carried deep unease about the growing possibility that local flashpoints could ignite wider confrontations. In short, the age of comfortable incrementalism has met an age of rapid escalation. Nowhere is that collision more evident than in the long shadow cast by the war in West Asia and the sudden disruptive choke point at the Strait of Hormuz. Over the past months, the narrow waterway that funnels a large share of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas has been the focus of headline-making attacks, naval standoffs, and insurance spikes. The practical consequence for Southeast Asia is immediate and painful. Many ASEAN economies rely on imported fuel to power everything from factories to fishing fleets. When a choke point like Hormuz threatens to close, it isn't an abstract geopolitical problem. It is a near-term shock to inflation, to shipping costs, and to household budgets. At the summit, energy security moved from the margins of discussion to the center. Officials spoke in blunt, private terms about emergency stockpiles, about the need to diversify suppliers, and about contingency plans for rerouting vital shipments. Proposals ranged from enhanced regional coordination on strategic oil reserves to accelerated talks on joint purchasing agreements and guaranteed transit corridors. Yet participants also acknowledge the familiar friction. National energy policies are woven tightly with politics, commercial contracts, and long-term strategic relationships. Aligning them rapidly and without one country's domestic politics feeling compromised will be a steep diplomatic climb. That difficulty highlights a core tension confronting ASEAN today. The bloc's consensus-driven model, prized for keeping the peace among diverse members, can also slow urgent action. When unanimity is the threshold for major moves, time is a scarce commodity. The region's finance ministers and central bankers spoke candidly about the economic fallout they are trying to blunt: supply chain disruptions, rising energy bills, and the growing risk that shocks in one part of the world will cascade into recessionary pressures here. They are preparing tools from coordinated market interventions to rigid fiscal cushions for the most vulnerable, but those tools require political will and, in many cases, cross-border cooperation that has historically taken months or years to build. If the need to respond quickly is driven by events beyond ASEAN's borders, fractures inside the region have proved no less grave. Myanmar remains perhaps the most acute and long-running challenge to the bloc's cohesion. Since the military coup in February 2021 removed the elected government led by Aung San Suu Kyi, Myanmar has slid into protracted violence, deepening humanitarian crises and a sprawling displacement of civilians. For ASEAN, the problem has been uniquely painful. A member state is the epicenter of conflict, and the usual diplomatic tools, quiet mediation, respectful engagement, and incremental pressure have yielded limited results. Recent developments have produced narrow openings, yet they are fragile. In late April 2026, the Myanmar authorities announced they had transferred Aung San Suu Kyi from prison to house arrest and reduced part of her sentence as part of a broader commutation program tied to a national holiday. The move sparked cautious hopes in some quarters that a more constructive cadence of dialogue might become possible. The Philippines, as chair, has pushed publicly for access to ASEAN Special Envoy and for the restoration of a pathway toward political dialogue. But even within ASEAN, there is no single script. Some members argue for sustained pressure and international isolation to compel the junta. Others favor calibrated engagement intended to preserve lines of communication and to influence outcomes on the ground. This divide, principle versus pragmatism, is not new. It is baked into the bloc's DNA. But it has taken on new urgency because the cost of inaction now looks higher. The humanitarian emergency in Myanmar is not isolated to its borders. Refugee flows, cross-border insurgencies, illicit arms movements, and the humanitarian erosion of entire regions are tangible spillovers that ripple through neighboring states. ASEAN understands this, but translating recognition into coordinated action without jeopardizing the unity that keeps the bloc together is the central diplomatic riddle of the moment. And then there is the South China Sea, a theater of competing claims where the stakes are sovereignty, resources, and strategic posture. The waters are among the busiest in the world, and they are a vital artery for the region's trade. Bristling boundary disputes and frequent naval and Coast Guard encounters have made the sea an ever-present danger zone. Negotiations with China to agree a code of conduct have been underway for years. Progress has been intermittent, and major questions remain about what such an agreement should look like. Should it be legally binding, and if so, how would enforcement work? Or is the aim primarily to set shared norms for behavior at sea? In recent meetings, ASEAN ministers reiterated a politica: commitment to conclude an effective and substantive code of conduct by 2026. That target speaks to an urgency many diplomats feel. A clear, agreed upon set of rules could reduce the risk that routine incidents, a collision between fishing vessels, a disputed arrest, a maritime blockade, will spiral into larger conflicts. But the hard bargaining points persist. Member states with overlapping claims must balance immediate defense and fishing interests with the economic imperative of a working relationship with major powers. For the region as a whole, the challenge is maintaining internal cohesion while managing external relationships, and doing so without making any single member feel abandoned or coerced. Not all the threats are grand strategy. Border skirmishes and local disputes continue to test ASEAN's capacity for peaceful mediation. A recent flare-up along the Thailand-Cambodia border reminded leaders that the fragile local ceasefires and confidence-building measures that underpin inter-regional peace need constant tending. The Philippines used its chairmanship to offer a facilitative role, hosting talks on the sidelines and pushing for mechanisms to monitor and de-escalate tensions before they become headline crises. These are the kinds of quiet interventions that define ASEAN's legacy. But they also depend on follow-through, transparency, and the patience to tackle problems that rarely make for dramatic immediate headlines. Economic resilience in this environment is both the goal and the battleground. ASEAN's economies are diverse and integrated, but they are also highly exposed to global volatility. The combination of energy shocks, disrupted sea lanes, and rising insurance and freight costs is pushing policymakers to consider contingency plans they largely shelved after the pandemic. Supply chains that were once rerouted around a single choke point are now facing the prospect of multi-point disruption. Businesses from small fisheries and coastal town to multinational manufacturers are recalibrating risk models. Governments are talking about backup supply corridors, regional grain reserves, and emergency logistics corridors, practical steps aimed at keeping food on shelves and fuel in tanks. One recurring theme at the summit was the need for a more proactive ASEAN, an entity that can act with urgency while preserving the deliberative culture that has sustained it. Several delegates captured that mood in blunt terms. One participant said, "We must focus on mitigating the economic fallout rather than waiting for global conflicts to resolve themselves." That line drives straight to the dilemma at the heart of the gathering. ASEAN cannot control every external conflict, but it can prepare, coordinate, and shield its populations from the worst of the fallout if member states are willing to make trade-offs and to cede a degree of unilateral advantage for broader stability. Practical initiatives were on the table. Ideas ranged from a pooled energy reserve facility and joint emergency procurement frameworks to enhanced information sharing on maritime incidents and a rapid response humanitarian support unit. Finance ministers signaled readiness to coordinate fiscal responses should shocks deepen. Central bank governors discuss swap lines and liquidity mechanisms to keep markets functioning. These are the tools of resilience. They will not remove the underlying geopolitical risks, but they can blunt the most immediate social and economic harms. Yet, even well-designed mechanisms depend on trust. And trust is the scarce commodity in a region where asymmetries of power and competing external partnerships shape national choices. ASEAN's challenge is therefore political as much as technical. To be more agile, it must find ways to build workable majorities, to create crisis cells that can act quickly with delegated authority, and to craft agreements that are meaningful without requiring unanimity for every action. T will require institutional innovation and a willingness to accept a different balance between national prerogatives and collective measures. There is also an opportunity in this turbulent moment. Crises can catalyze cooperation when they clarify shared stakes. A shipping lane that matters to 5 countries creates a natural incentive to coordinate energy insecurity that hits several economies at once, pushes finance ministries to talk the language of mutual defense, economic defense, that is. The Philippines chairmanship has tried to frame 2026 around practical deliverables, peace and security, economic stability, and people-centered empowerment. If the summit can move from abstract rhetoric to a few visible operational commitments, it could revive confidence that ASEAN remains more than a talking shop. Whatever follows this week in Manila, the reality is stark. The status quo is no longer sufficient. Global power competition, rapid technological change, and transnational shocks, like climate disasters and cyber incidents, are all reshaping the operating environment. An ASEAN that wants to protect its prosperity and its people must adapt faster, smarter, and with a readiness to take collective action when necessary. The questions before leaders are both strategic and personal. Can ASEAN preserve the norms that have kept the region stable while becoming faster and more decisive? Can member states reconcile national interests with the need for common responses to shared threats? And perhaps most difficult, when a member state becomes a source of instability, what tools are both effective and consistent with the region's commitment to non-interference? Answers will take time. But the urgency is unmistakable. The summit in the Philippines has been as much a reckoning as a conference, a moment to confront the limits of old habits and to map the outlines of a sturdier, more responsive regional architecture. The choices made here will not erase the conflicts that spy ill into the region. They can, however, shape how resilient ASEAN is in the face of them, how quickly it cushions its people, how effectively it keeps trade flowing, and how credibly it defends the collective interest of a region that has become indispensable to the global economy. On the last evening of talks, as leaders read prepared statements and dispatched ministers to emergency planning sessions, one theme threaded through nearly every conversation: the future will be defined by how well the region holds together now. The phrase was simple but heavy with consequence. Unity matters in a world where crises can move faster than summits. Unity is not merely symbolic. It is a form of protection, a competitive advantage, and increasingly the only realistic path to preserving the prosperity of tens of millions of people across a vast and complex region. This summit will not and cannot resolve every conflict at once, but it has the potential to mark a shift from reactive fragmentation to coordinated preparedness. Whether that potential is realized will depend on whether leaders can translate rhetoric into rules and rules into rapid, credible action. For the people of Southeast Asia, the stakes could not be clearer: more agile. United ASEAN would mean more stable prices at the market, safer seas for fishermen and freighters, and more reliable protection for vulnerable populations caught in the crossfire of other people's wars. That, in the end, is the measure that matters.